Hey everybody, Eric Meyer from Generation Atomic here. We're excited to watch a video of the Minnesota Senate Energy Committee testimony that happened last week. We're talking about lifting the moratorium in our home state here. I brought on a couple of friends that know even more about nuclear than I do, and they will introduce themselves now.
Yeah, I'm Philip. I live in Minnesota, so this stuff's personal for me. I studied nuclear engineering at Cambridge University and really excited to see what's going to go on here.
My name's Alyssa. I'm also from Generation Atomic, and I am not in Minnesota, but I am in the last year of my PhD at the University of Tennessee.
All right, let's do this. Here we go. We got Lindsay Potter from Nuke Watch.
All right, my name is Lindsay Potter. I'm here today in opposition to SF 350 and SF 468 on behalf of Nuke Watch and the Coalition for a Nuclear-Free Mississippi River. In an attempt to keep things brief, I will say I was going to second the previous speaker's notes on the cost overruns and time that it takes to build the only conventional new reactors that have been attempted to be built in this country in the last 15 years. I will also note that often...
It's just kind of funny because you'd think that you'd connect the fact that we haven't built a reactor in this country for 3 decades to the fact that the first one was expensive and over budget. Do you think maybe those things are connected?
I don't know if you guys saw Rachel Slabaw's article that got put out about how everyone really wants to be number 5 because as the more you build, the more experience we get building the reactors, the cheaper they get, the more reliable the supply chain is, etc. And so like once you get to like that 5th one, now they're very cost competitive. And we're past 1 and 2.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're even seeing those decreases in costs come down in just in the second unit of Vogtle. So, keep that up, especially the DOE report did a pretty good job. The Advanced Nuclear Liftoff report did a great job of kind of explaining how that learning reduces costs.
Yeah, it was like 30% cheaper with that second unit in Georgia, right, in Vogtle. So, got to build the same reactor a few more times, and the costs will come down. And we haven't said anything about system costs yet, but we'll get there later.
Those are handed on to the ratepayer, as in the case with the failed Tyrone Energy Park, a nuclear project planned by Northern States Power that was canceled in 1979 when NSP passed on $80 million in losses to ratepayers despite generating no electricity. I will also point out that in the failure...
So I looked this up because I didn't know a lot about this. So that $80 million, turned out it ended up being $3.80 per customer per year for 5 years. So less than 20 bucks per customer spread out over 5 years. But 80 million does sound a lot scarier. And why did it get canceled? Well, they were trying to build it, and then 3 Mile Island happened that same exact year that they canceled it. So, a lot of projects suffered as a result of that mess up there.
So I think what you're saying, Eric, is that would be the absolute worst case is $20 per year.
Yes.
And if the alternative to that is like a little bit more renewables, but like mostly more natural gas, like personally, like as a consumer, I would be more than willing to pay 20 bucks over 5 years to have cleaner energy.
Yeah, I mean, what they did instead was build a coal plant. So
the worst kind.
Yeah, would have been nice if they finished that. It was like a 1.1 gigawatt reactor. If they got it done, man, it would still be rocking to this day. But alas.
Of the 2 Westinghouse reactors at Virgil C. Summer attempted to be built down in South Carolina, that was a $9 billion cost passed on to ratepayers that generated no electricity. In the case of SMRs, I'd like to say that on page 155 of Excel's current integrated resource plan, which is before the Minnesota PUC right now, Excel's own modeling and Compass software did not select for an SMR when given the option to select for an SMR as a future energy source.
So I looked at this Excel IRP. I've been following it. So this is the plan that Excel has to put out to the public and to the Public Utilities Commission, explaining how they're going to generate power over the next 10 years. And the crux of the report is we have a shortfall of electricity and we don't know how to backfill it with stable, firm generation. And we have 3 options. 1, long-term batteries. 2, hydrogen burned in turbines, or 3, SMRs. So those are the 3 options that Excel considered. And I'll just point out 2 of them don't exist. I guess SMRs don't necessarily exist yet, but at least it's a technology that is possible to implement. So yeah, the software at Excel didn't select for any of them is the missing part here.
And they don't tell us what they put into the model for like assumed costs. But what do you think? Is it probably NuScale? Most likely.
Most likely, hard to say.
But even
So,
Excel's
see.
own
It's
modeling
black
software
box.
cannot justify the huge cost of building new nuclear infrastructure, even with technologies that are advertised as smaller and easier to construct. Likewise, the only SMR project approved in the United States has already been canceled due to cost overruns. NuScale and utility partner UAMPS agreed to build a dozen 77 megawatt reactors at the Idaho National Laboratory to begin delivering electricity in 2029, but the cost per megawatt hour rose 53% and subscribers pulled out. The deal was canceled despite having received $232 million in taxpayer handouts.
And what are they going to do instead? They're going to build a gas plant. So great. Yeah, that was a bummer, but I think for a lot of nuclear advocates, not that surprising. Just based on NuScale's design that requires quite a bit of concrete for something that's hoping to be, small and modular. The civil works side of it is pretty huge, but that's not true of all of the advanced reactor designs.
I just don't understand like the clean energy renewable like fan strategy of saying like, oh, I am willing to pay more as a consumer, or I like am okay with consumers having to pay more for like clean energy if it's coming from my favorite technology. But suddenly that's just not okay if it's not coming from like my favorite technology. Like, can we I would love to be able to just like agree on like the baseline, like, yeah, with clean energy and not emitting carbon dioxide and contributing to like climate change is like something that does cost a little bit extra money, but like if you can't cherry pick when you are and are not okay with it.
Yeah, I think it's funny. A lot of the people who are very pro renewables and suspicious of nuclear tend to fall in a spectrum where they want capital to be spent for the betterment of people, and they don't want corporations getting rich, those evil corporations. And yet, one of their primaries against nuclear is that it offers insufficient short term gains to the investment class. I don't know.
Well, so think of the shareholder. Like,
Think of the
no.
shareholder.
But what about their money?
Their schedules for completion, some of them 300% over budget and taking as long as 12 to 13 years to construct. A 2020 Lazard study estimated that the levelized cost of energy
Lazard.
No.
Classic.
is nearly 4 times the highest cost estimates of wind and utility scale solar. And on that point, I will just note that also on the DOC's the Department of Commerce, that is, in Minnesota's current docket for the IRP, they write that just continuing the operating licenses for Excel's current reactors displaces generation from wind and solar.
Now it's my turn. So right now she's comparing, right? So I just complained about like paying more, right? And now I think it is fair to compare like cost of nuclear to cost of renewables. But the thing is, that's not the thing that they ended up picking instead. The thing they ended up picking instead was the coal plant in like the NuScale Utah case, right? Like it's not like, oh, when they don't build nuclear reactors, they are building renewables. That's not what's happening.
One, going back to Lazard for a second, they used the 2020 study for some reason. I thought that was interesting because the 2024 is out and it actually has costs included with storage for solar and wind, something that they did not do in 2020. And all of a sudden, if you add in storage, it does get a lot closer. And then if you read the fine print of the Lazard, you realize that storage, that's not any kind of long duration. That's only 4 hours of storage to count as storage in their charts, which definitely won't get you through the Minnesota winters. On the replacing generation stuff, like for one, nuclear is super low carbon anyway, so it's not like getting low carbon energy from renewables is better than nuclear for some reason. Arguably, it's worse if it's solar in particular because it's actually higher carbon intensity. It's like 48 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, in opposed to 12 grams according to the IPCC. But anyway, it kind of communicates a little bit of a lack of understanding how the grid works, where if you do have a surplus of power, it can often be exported to other states. Maybe that's hard for Minnesotans to grasp because we have been power importers for a long time, and not always clean power, by the way. We get a lot of dirty coal power from North Dakota to help keep our lights on.
I ask you, would displace what generation? It may displace generation from renewable sources. Lastly, I want to say that our group has been closely following the tritium leak from the Monticello nuclear reactor in 2022. And though there's science out there that I would say disagrees with Mr. Meyer's testimony that the tritium was safe to drink, I want to note especially that Xcel was not a trusted and transparent partner. And that's what I think we need to look at closely here, whatever science on tritium you subscribe to.
Whatever science on tritium you subscribe to?
Yeah. If she's wondering what science I subscribe to, it's the study where they gave mice a lot of tritiated water at higher and higher concentrations over, basically until they started to see biological effects. You will see that the concentration of tritium in the water that was leaked at Monticello is let's see, at least 2 orders of magnitude lower than the lowest level that was detectable as having any sort of health effects in mice. It like way under anything that could be like measurable harm. So it's like a vanishingly small amount. You have to drink 8 gallons to get a similar amount of radiation you get from a chest x-ray. It's silly. Drinking a cup is equivalent to flying for 15 minutes at altitude, just from cosmic radiation. So that's the science I subscribe to, like the science.
Like the science that is peer reviewed, widely agreed upon by like every single radiological engineer who isn't like laughed out of a conference, that is.
Yeah, actual like radiation health physicists who like spend their whole life studying this stuff. Yeah.
Of the radioactive water that reached the Mississippi River did so in September. The NRC did not even consider the month of September in its environmental impact statement for running Monticello. So I don't think either of those organizations are doing a proper job being transparent with the public and truly reflecting the public health hazards, the environmental hazards of operating a nuclear reactor. So I can't trust them to do so with new nuclear infrastructure in the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
I think she has a good point about like transparency. I think that it is right of the public to be like, all right, this is like a piece of information that I would want to see and I could not find it in the report. I think it's fair to be like, I'm wondering about these numbers because they were in the text alluded to, but then like the data itself is either not presented or not easily findable by the public. And I think those are like valid criticisms. I do think the NRC in all of the things that they do publish and in the rest of the report is like more transparent than not, right? And they are an incredibly thorough organization, which is one of the main reasons that nuclear is so scrutinized, so expensive to license, because we are more tightly regulated than any other energy industry. But like at the same time, there's always room for improvement when it comes to the way that we communicate with the public. And I think that she does have a valid point.
I also kind of dragged Xcel for this because they didn't do a great job. When they announced it, they said, hey, 400,000 gallons Imperial unit leaked of water that had a radiation concentration of 5 million picocuries per liter metric. And weird unit as well. And then they didn't give any of the journalists any context for what that meant.
I finished my bachelor's degree in nuclear and radiological engineering in 2019. I don't know how to think about that. Like, what is a picocurie? Like, okay, like, yes, I know what like pico and I know what curie is. Okay, but like in terms of relating that to like concentration of contaminated water and like what that means in terms of like if you were to consume a certain amount, what the biological like dose or risk would be. Um, like I would have to sit down with a pen and paper and do some back of the envelope math to figure it out. Like even someone as educated as me in radiation science doesn't like automatically know what that means. Their public has no shot.
Yeah, and it's especially useless because Curie isn't a measurement of radiation dose. It's just a measure of activity. So you actually have to know what the Curie is, the material is, and then compare that to, well, is this particular material an energetic emitter like cobalt 60, or is it a trivial emitter like tritium? So it's got to put that factor into.
It's like 74 times less powerful of a decay than the potassium. That 40, that's in a banana. And important context.
Thank you, chairs, senators. My name is George Crocker. I'm the executive director of the North American Water Office, which is a nonprofit that has been dealing with the issues of energy and environmental justice since its inception in 1982. I'm very appreciative of being here to testify in that I am probably as responsible as anyone for the fact that Minnesota has a moratorium on nuclear power, and for good reason, many of which have already been articulated. But there's new information now that we did not have in 1994. And that new information is truly horrifying. The latency period for cancers is about 20 years. In 1994, Prairie Island had only been online for 20 years. We didn't know. Now we know. Nuclear power is a murderous machine.
Yeah. My goodness. And there's no like credible path for the amount of radioactivity needed to induce cancer to have been leaked from the plant without there being a ton of evidence for it. And there just is that if somebody did a study like that, they probably weren't able to control for the fact that we have the largest coal plant in the state less than 3 miles away from the nuclear plant. And we know that coal causes health problems like that.
Constituents. Now, the data comes from the Centers of Disease Control.
Okay. Okay.
It's reputable data, and it's analyzed by reputable people, epidemiologists with business degrees and degrees in public health, master's degrees. And that data tells us
That's the best epidemiologists have business degrees.
Business degrees.
I'm gonna choose to believe that that was like a misspeak on his part because he's like kind of like hyped up. I'm gonna choose to believe he didn't mean to say that.
He said the Center for the Disease Control. I wonder if this is another one of those organizations that sounds like it's a real organization. Like he's the North American Water Office, which sounds pretty official. But is this just like another one where they just kind of make it sound like it's a thing?
I doubt. Like I don't want to like like make up like dumb like it, yes like it is fun to like joke, but like to say stuff that like is like it's such a big straw man argument that could easily like discredit our other like actual methods of like other things that people say, So like he did clarify that it's a nonprofit, like the North American Water Office, and I do think he genuinely means like the actual American CDC, and I do think he means to say like epidemiologist or like masters in public health, right? And that would be the proper organization that would have done like longitudinal cancer incidence studies.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm having too much fun here.
Hello, and at Prairie Island, every month, you're killing 3 to 4 people every month. Think what would
Are we gonna
happen
talk about
if you
how he got those numbers? Does George go on to say like how he got no the three?
I did look into some of these claims, and I think where he gets the radiological release is not from the tritium. It has to do with spent nuclear fuel after the fission creates some radiological gases, radioactive gases. And normally in a plant, they'll hold them internal to the plant while they decay away over 30, 60 days. And then they vent the air that used to contain the now decayed radioactive isotopes out of stack. And they do that after monitoring. And the argument that was made that I heard George make is that these releases are actually releases of highly radioactive gases like xenon and stuff like that. So it's something to do with that. It's the best.
It sounds like he's making the claim that there's a causal relationship between only that source and any like possibly statistically insignificant, possibly statistically significant change in cancer incidence over a 20-year study period, right? So, like, but to Eric's point, there's the coal plant 3 miles away, right? And like, there isn't as significant monitoring of like radioactivity in coal plant exhaust. And we know that coal isn't like put through this long giant like supply chain process that uranium ore has to be put through in order to be processed into like uranium oxide pellets that are the fuel for our plants, right? We mine the coal, goes on the train car, goes directly into the coal plant,
Straight
and
into the fire.
straight into the fire. And not just the coal, but all of the other impurities in the coal, many of which are radionuclides. That when the coal is burned, like the exhaust still carries with it those same impurities, and some of which get filtered out, some of which don't. Some of which end up like in your electrostatic precipitator does take out some of those impurities, but it doesn't take out enough to the point where like your exhaust from a coal smokestack as is the same or less in terms of radioactivity as what is vented from like used nuclear fuel.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking about what doesn't go out the smokestack, it just goes down to the bottom of the furnace and then gets thrown out in the backyard as coal ash. It just doesn't put it just directly into the air. It just puts it onto the ground where the wind puts it in the air.
think what would happen if you had headlines in your paper, serial killer on the loose, cops don't care. That's what's going on. You don't care. You talk about we need no more nuclear power. You don't even know how to say nuclear.
Okay, he's got a point there.
That's,
That's the only valid point he's made so far.
this is a great way to get politicians on your side.
Yeah.
And this Senate and this legislature goes ahead and lifts the moratorium and endorses more nuclear power in Minnesota while we're already killing our own. May you all go to hell.
Oh my God.
Now, there is another way to provide energy services. I wrote a book about it. You would be well advised to read this and learn. It's called About Power: How to Democratize Electricity Now. We don't need nuclear power to meet our energy needs any more than we need a bullet in the head to stay healthy.
Mr. Crocker, I'm afraid
I'm
we're going to have to
done.
move on. Thank you. Mr. Evans.
Oh, man.
Like they're publicly owned nuclear power plants, like Cooper Power Station in Nebraska, like the TVA. Yeah, it's like technically like a, maybe they're like not like the most, like they're not like the perfect example, but they are like that. Those are public utilities that are legally owned by members of the public. Like if that's like one of the closest things we have in this country to democratize energy.
Yeah, I think it may be worth taking a moment to hear what Mr. Cocker's feeling, right? Because there are people who are genuinely this scared. This is what they think, this is what they've thought. And so it's kind of easy for us to kind of smugly sit here and, oh my God, eye roll, I can't believe he said that. But I don't think that there's any doubt that he's sincere. And there are plenty of people who have that same sincere belief. And it's a challenge that we as advocates have to try and figure out how to work through.
Yeah, definitely got to give him points for very strong delivery, memorable, dramatic testimony there. If I can sometime in if I get testimony, I can tell everybody to go to hell. That's gonna be a fun testimony. I couldn't help but think Chair Green looked like Hide the Pain Harold, and so that meme was just like seared into my mind during this entire hearing.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Thank you. I'm Vita Konitz. I am co-director of the DFL Environmental Caucus. I'm also a retired science teacher after 4 decades.
So the DFL Environmental Caucus is the part of Minnesota's Democratic Party. So DFL is Democratic Farmer Labor Party is what we call it here instead of like DNC.
And concerned mom and grandma. I thank you, Chair Green, and members of the committee for hearing my testimony. I was in attendance last week when you all heard testimony regarding data centers and nuclear power, and they were linked together. And it was very surprising to me to hear nuclear power described as zero carbon, so emitting, because my background tells me otherwise. Mark Jacobson recently testified to the U.S.
You mean the guy that tried to sue a different guy who pointed out problems in his research and lost that suit and had to pay all the legal costs?
Mark Z published in the Annals of Science of PNAS, and then someone else wrote back in PNAS, this peer review, criticizing how the study was done. I won't get into the details, but basically saying, I think you missed some stuff. And his response was to sue PNAS, Chris Clack, and some of the other guys.
You know, his work is critiqued for being extremely self-referential, where the sources that he cites are like his other papers, and it's all very circular. And that there's some problematic stuff on their website too. Like they have like these 100% renewables plans for every country in the world, and you look at them and it's like, oh, how's Somalia going to get to 100% renewables? Oh, they're going to reduce their energy demand by 70%. It's like, and you look it up and they're already using like way less than a refrigerator. It's per person. Like, how are they going to cut back more, man? So they clearly just kind of use some macro to extrapolate one plan to a whole bunch of countries. If you're looking especially for carbon emissions, you got the IEA, the International Energy Agency, took a look at life cycle CO2 emissions for nuclear. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looked at it as well. So you have these huge international organizations with hundreds of scientists that have looked into this, but you're just picking the one guy who says that nuclear is super carbon intensive. And if you look into his work, the reason why is he includes the carbon emissions from an eventual nuclear war that would happen just because you're using nuclear energy. So like for Vita to parrot that and be like, I know this because I'm a science teacher and a mom, is like not cool. You can't run on those credentials and then use such shoddy scientific work.
Said you have to look at the total life cycle of an energy source. And nuclear really uses a lot of, or emits a lot of carbon through its construction, which uses large amounts of concrete and metal, decommissioning, fuel processing, uranium mining and enrichment. All of these rely heavily on fossil fuels, giving it a carbon footprint of 78 to 178 grams per CO2 per kilowatt hour, not zero.
Try to like 5 to 12, like that's the real range. It's like in the single digits.
Kilowatt hour.
Yeah, per kilowatt hour. Yeah.
Basically all of the sources that Eric listed like 2 minutes ago, like the IPCC and the IEA, they take things like transportation of fuel, enrichment, mining, all those things are taken into account. The construction of the plant, duh, that's like the main contributor to the very small amount of carbon emissions life cycle wise that do come from building nuclear power. But like we already know that. Like she's acting like this is like new information that like people aren't taking into account when they do that. They are. We know. It's just that like you use such a small mass of uranium, like per watt that you produce for nuclear, that like the collective construction for like the enrichment plan and the mining activity like adds so little per watt just because we don't need that much uranium as compared to something like a coal plant would.
I would say it's actually harder to find information that indicates nuclear has high carbon emissions than it is to find low. So this is her like Googling on like the fourth page of Google trying to find something that conforms to her belief that nuclear is a carbon intensive energy source when you can just look up the our world in data chart right here.
And this chart uses IPCC, UNSCEAR.
That it takes 10 to 22 years for nuclear to come online relative to 1 to 5 for wind or solar. Those are extra years that we simply cannot afford to waste. We'd be much better off, as already had been suggested, to ramp up and invest in much cheaper renewable energy sources such wind and solar and battery storage. Also, here's something that you haven't, I think, considered. During that 10 to 22 year period that we're waiting for those plants to come online, we will continue to see premature deaths due to the air pollution.
The 10 to 22, 1 to 5 thing, it matters like where you're looking, what kind of data you're cherry picking. Something that came to mind was the like kind of the difference between bikes and freight train. Like if you wanted to move a bunch of people quickly, you could probably make a whole bunch of bikes and people could ride those bikes and get from A to B. But if you wanted to move a bunch of stuff for decades and reliably and on immense scales, that's going to take longer to build the tracks, build the train, all that kind of stuff. So these are two different products, right? We got solar that gives you energy during the day, more during the summer than in the winter. Got to store it. It's easy to throw up, but it doesn't give you that reliable power that you need to build a economy on, versus nuclear. That's some serious infrastructure that will power your state, your manufacturing, your hospitals in any weather condition, and it's there for a century. So these are different things. It's like tents versus houses.
Also, an issue of time to build is not the same as time to plan to time when it's online, right? You look at the interconnection grid, there are projects that are waiting to be built on wind and solar that don't have transmission, and they've been sitting there for 10, 15 years. So when you have a smaller generator, like a smaller solar field, it's very difficult to justify building huge transmission lines to go all the way out to the middle nowhere. And so there's a lot of these solar and wind projects that either get canceled or take 15, 20 years simply because they're waiting on the interconnects.
This is a hearing about should we even allow for this company that is already interested in building this project here to do so, right? Should we make it legal for them to do so? And then they're coming and saying like, oh, but we want you to build wind and solar. Like you can advocate for both. But if there is like someone, a company that wanted to build a solar farm as well, you can advocate for that also, right? Like, especially if it's like a different company and they're not like competing for the exact same grant money or the exact same pool of funds, right? Like there is a projected increase in energy demand largely because of data centers that I don't necessarily agree are the most productive for humanity, but if there is an increase in energy demand that we think is going to happen in the United States anyway, like you can advocate for lots of different good clean energies to be constructed. And it doesn't have to be like deny the nuclear people just so I can build more solar. Like that's not how that's not how energy diversity works.
There's still so much fossil resources on the grid, so many fossil resources on the grid. Yeah, we got 7 large coal plants that are going to be retired by 2035 in Minnesota. There's tons of gas still on our grid, and like I said, we're still importing power from places like North Dakota that burn a lot of coal. So the like zero-sum mentality doesn't make a lot of sense.
I would like to wrap up by, again, speaking to the waste issue. This waste needs to be stored for 200,000 years or more. I want you all to please ask yourself, if you want to approve a nuclear power plant in Minnesota, if that waste is transported past your house, or if that facility is near your residence. The people of Prairie Island have said no. The people of Nevada said no. Unless you want this waste passing by and stored near your home, you should also say no to lifting the moratorium.
I do want to touch on like the whole like, oh, like, would you want the waste to go by your house and the NIMBYism? And for those who might say no, would you want a natural gas plant to be built in its place? What about the people who already live near the coal plants that could otherwise be shut down? Do you think they want to be living next to those coal plants? I'm coming from like a little bit of like a biased background, right? Because there's like photo shoots of like me on the internet, like sitting on top of nuclear waste casts, but like for good reason, right? I think this is part of, again, like a valid criticism of the nuclear industry as a whole is transparency when it comes to the level of like radioactivity or risk to the public and or lack thereof, by encouraging more people to come visit to see what the waste pads actually look like. I've been on tours of nuclear plants where they like wouldn't allow us to go to the waste pad and like take pics. Why not? There's not like a health or safety reason why we wouldn't have been able to, and I've been able to do that at other plants, right? So I think like there is room for the industry to grow and to encourage people to learn about those things. So that way we're not like afraid of building and storing them when really there's not like a significant risk to the public in the first.
Yeah, and I think it's telling that the argument against the waste is, would you want it near you? Isn't it scary? Right? In Veda assessment, there's no actual attestation of risk. I mean, Crocker at least made some good claims. Here, Veda is just kind of saying, but you're scared, right?
It's great to be back. I have the opportunity to testify again. I'm Eric Meyer, founder and director of the Minnesota environmental nonprofit Generation Atomic. Over the past few years, we've talked to thousands of Minnesotans about nuclear energy at places like the State Fair and Pride festivals, and we've put together this coalition of labor, environmental, and business communities that is now proud to join this larger Minnesota Nuclear Energy Alliance and push for lifting the 30-year-old ban on new nuclear in our great state. I won't tell you nuclear energy is our most reliable carbon-free energy source. You already know that. I won't recite how nuclear generation requires less land and mining than solar farms and wind turbines. You've heard those numbers as well. And I won't remind you that our neighbors to the north in Ontario burned their last load of coal in 2014, a decade ago, and achieved the fastest greenhouse gas reduction in North American history by going from coal to nuclear.
So I liked your rhetorical device of saying, I'll pass by without mentioning. I think I first heard that technique used kind of comically in some legislative action. Who knows if it was in Rome or something, but it was basically like, given the importance of this place we are, it would be uncouth of me, so I will pass by without mentioning what a jerk you are.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, just trying to say, oh, this is all common sense stuff while I
This is neither the time nor place to explain how you smell like beetles.
Or that Ontario is currently doubling down and building advanced reactors. I mentioned that the last time I testified. I think most of you already know that Xcel's tritium leak, while a PR disaster, presented no danger to the public. You'd have to drink 8 undiluted gallons directly from the leak
to match the radiation dose we get from a standard chest X-ray. You may hear from other folks testifying today concerns about the spent fuel, which is a burden on local communities and is hazardous, but thankfully not dangerous, thanks to the incredibly robust containers we put it in. Here's me kissing one of these casts to prove that point, and I'm happy to report that my Geiger counter was clicking less than it does when I put it on this vintage Fiestaware plate right here.
Props. What do we think about props and testimony?
I like that it's like something physical that you've like brought into the room that no one probably batted an eye at or was afraid of whatsoever, like that entire time that you would have been sitting in the room before the testimony began.
Something more radioactive than nuclear waste. Right there.
I think the new standard though for like images of like people up close and personal with nuclear waste needs to be Maddie Hilly's like pregnancy shoot.
But I will say this, Minnesota's choice isn't about technology, it's about legacy. 7 coal plants will shutter by 2040. Power demand will probably triple. We can either cling to a ban written when dial-up internet was cutting-edge technology, or we can open our minds and embrace the generational opportunity that lies before us. I think SF50 really does that by just a clean lift. SF468, I think, attempts to, but that arbitrary limit does exclude some of our most promising designs that are being built elsewhere in the country or were recently built. So right now, billions in federal funding and private investment are flowing into nuclear projects across the country, and states are competing to attract these projects. Wisconsin, Montana, Illinois, Connecticut, Kentucky, and West Virginia have all passed bills to allow new nuclear in their states. Utah, just on Monday, established a consortium to develop and deploy new reactors. Oregon, California, and Rhode Island are also currently looking at lifting their bans on new nuclear. Meanwhile, shuttered plants are being restarted in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and as of 2 weeks ago, Iowa. Minnesota can either lift the ban to attract these investments, or we can watch as other states secure the jobs, tax revenue, and reliable clean energy that could have been ours. But hesitation has a cost. Federal dollars and private capital aren't waiting. Every state that lifts its ban becomes a magnet for this investment. Every delay makes Minnesota a spectator in our own energy story. Let's not let 2040 be the winter we tell our kids and grandkids we knew what to do, we just didn't do it. Thank you.
So good. Oh.
Thanks, guys. Unfortunately, that was right before the Nuke Watch person. I would have loved to go after some of those guys, but well, that was a lot of fun. Thanks for doing that with us. And Philip, thanks for steering all of the behind the scenes technical aspects of this. Hopefully we can do it again sometime, and hopefully we can lift the moratorium in Minnesota.
Heck yeah. So
Thanks so much,
great.
guys.